Today I want to talk about the book of Obadiah. It's only 21 verses. It's the shortest book in the Old Testament. It is a quick read, but it has an important message for every one of us today. And to help me get into that message, I have to confess to you, I recently saw the new Elvis movie. That's Elvis Presley, for those not familiar. And spoiler alert, we all know he died in 1977, so you'll see that in the movie. But this movie starts out with the question by his manager. He's played by Tom Hanks. He's an old guy in a hospital room. And the question comes up, who killed Elvis? He died at 42 years of age, should have lived longer. And so who killed him? Was he responsible for his own death? Was it the doctor prescribing all of these drugs and medications? Was it various other people, and a lot of fingers were pointed at his manager, Tom Parker. Tom Parker's narrating the story, who killed him. In the end of the movie, there's a scene when the manager asks that question again, when you get to the point where Elvis dies, and he answers the question, who killed Elvis? And he says it was love. He said love killed Elvis, but it was obvious in the context what he meant by that. It was love of the applause, love of the crowd, love of being the cultural icon, love of being a rock idol, a pop idol. It was the love of being the center of attention. You know, Elvis is not the only person who has fallen in love with the crowd and loves applause and affirmation and attention. I think today with social media, and with our selfie culture, you don't have to be as famous as Elvis. You could have 10 followers and still be obsessed with the adoration of the crowd, whether it's small or large. The obsession with posting everything that we ever do or eat or think or pretend that somehow we have to get that attention is sort of the same thing. It is deadly. And what we see in Obadiah, we see a prophecy, a short prophecy to Edom. And if you think about Edom, and we'll get back to this whole idea of pride and the self-absorption of our culture, but this prophetic vision, in verse 1 it says, the vision of Obadiah. Obadiah was this prophet speaking in, but not to Israel, but we see in verse 1 it's to Edom. It's the word of the Lord to Edom. Abraham's son Isaac had twins, Jacob and Esau, and they were fighting, wrestling in the womb. They were wrestling growing up over the birthright, over the blessing. There was not a lot of love between these two brothers, and it caused great separation. You know the story. Eventually, the descendants of Jacob are known as Israel. The descendants of Esau are known as Edom. And now we're almost 1,000 years later in this prophetic word from Obadiah, and the descendants of Jacob and Esau. In other words, Israel and Edom are still at it, except now it's not just two brothers, it's two cultures, it's two communities, it's two nations, it's two peoples. And what prompted this prophetic judgment from Obadiah, when the Babylonians came and captured Israel, dragged off, remember Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Daniel, dragged off these people to captivity in Babylon. When all this is happening, their cousins, the cousins of the Israelites, the Edomites, okay, Jacob and Esau, it's relived. Instead of these descendants of Abraham helping their distant relatives, they actually jump in and take the side of the Babylonians, and once they're gone, they start ransacking what little is left. And that brought on this prophetic judgment. And so Obadiah, this prophet, is speaking a judgment to Edom, to the descendants of Esau. And here's what he says, verse 2, "Behold, I will make you small among the nations. You shall be utterly despised." And so they're thinking they're kind of on the top of the hill now. They're playing king of the hill with their cousins, okay? The same way Jacob and Esau fought, but now finally, Edom has the upper hand. And because the Babylonians have crushed the Israelites, the Edomites are coming in and crushing them further. They think they're on the top. He says, but I will make you small. Verse 3, here's the reason for the judgment. The pride of your heart has deceived you. What's the reason for judgment? In this case, pride. Pride of the heart. Pride is always a heart issue. And the result of pride is we're deceived. We think everything's okay and it's not. There are things that are clearly wrong, but our pride somehow convinces us they're not wrong, they're okay or even right. It's really acceptable. Pride is one of the most deceitful things that we accept into our heart. It clouds the way we see everything. It becomes these tainted, tinted glasses, and everything looks different when we look through pride. The pride of your heart has deceived you. Here he goes on. You who live in the clefts of the rock, in your lofty dwellings, and literally the Edomites lived on the top of a mountain or hill, who say in your heart, there it is, there's a heart issue again. The pride of your heart, you say in your heart, who will bring me down to the ground? And there's this pride of we're on the top, we'll always be on the top, even though their history showed that they weren't always on the top. But they're so proud, they've rewritten it, and in their mind, this is where they've always been, it's where they always will be. Verse 4, though you soar aloft like the eagle, though your nest is set among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord. Wow, what a word. That's the prophecy none of us want to ever hear. God saying, I will bring you down. I will take you down. I will take you out. Why? Pride. When I reflected back reading this text, thinking about that Elvis movie, okay, like any biop, some of it is Hollywood, some of it's really real. But I think about, without trying to diagnose someone, it reminded me of this figure in ancient Greek mythology, Narcissus. Narcissus was a hunter who was known to be really handsome. I guess if he were a professional wrestler, he would be the handsome hunter. All right, and he was obsessed with himself. He was so in love with himself, none of the romantic interest ever connected until once when he fell head over heels in love with his own reflection in a still pond. He looked down to drink water on a hunt. He looks down, he sees the most beautiful sight he's ever seen, and it's his reflection coming back. And so in the Greek mythology, Narcissus lived the rest of his life until his death day, staring at his own face, his own reflection in the water. Again, it reminds me of so much of our narcissistic, that's where the word narcissistic comes from Narcissus, this guy falling in love with his own image and being obsessed with himself. And we have this condition now called narcissistic personality disorder. And again, I can't diagnose it, but boy, we can all kind of sense it all around us. And what it is, in essence, is a grandiose idea of self-importance. Narcissistic thinking and ideas and self-centeredness that leads to a disorder, that leads to dysfunction. It's a grandiose sense of self-importance. It's an excessive need for affirmation. And I think about that scene in that Elvis movie, his great need for the applause of the crowd. And this manager going, that's what's killed him right there. That love of applause and affirmation. And finally, this narcissism, when it goes deep, it also results, and logically so, with the inability to empathize with others' feelings. When it's all about me, others' feelings don't matter. This doesn't use that phrase, but when we read about Edom, it's just labeled here as the pride of your heart and saying these arrogant things in the heart. But it reminds me of a lot of the descriptions of narcissism and a lot of the self-importance and self-absorption that is running rampant in modern culture. And so it's not just a judgment of the pride of Edom. And he goes on, and you can read, it's some haunting prophetic judgment spoken. But then it gets to this, and so often when there's a sin, when there's a pattern of sin identified in a nation being judged, so often the prophets don't leave it there. They kind of spread it broad in a much broader sense to the human condition. And so he goes on in verse 15, for the day of the Lord is near upon all the nations. And so all of these things up until the first 14 verses are spoken directly to Edom, but now he shifts gears and goes, when he's speaking of this, it's also coming upon all the nations. This judgment of Edom's pride is now this phrase, the day of the Lord, speaking of that judgment that's coming, and now it applies to everyone. And so, lest we look at Edom and go, boy, those horrible people who God just had it with their pride and brought judgment, and their pride led them to be unjust and violent and really dishonest and everything you can imagine toward the descendants of Jacob, toward Israel. In their worst moment when they needed help, they came in and did the opposite. It was motivated by pride. And we look at that and we think that we're exempt, but then this judgment word is applied across the board to all the nations. Now, so often a judgment to one group, when we really read it, we realize, wow, that could have been spoken to me as well. But the good thing about the prophetic words in the Old Testament, they almost never just end with a judgment spoken and then that's the end of it. There's always a hope. There's a hope baked into it, that there's a better future God has planned. God's judgments so often are designed and explicitly said to lead us back to Him, that we would know Him, that we would turn to Him, that we would turn to His mercy and grace. And this is no different. The last verse, the 21st verse in here, when it's kind of coming out of the judgment into the hope. Verse 21, it says, "Saviors shall go up to Mount Zion, to rule Mount Esau, and the kingdom shall be the Lord's." So even as this judgment is being spoken because of the pride, there is this hope that it's going to be God's kingdom in the end. Other kingdoms that are combating against God's kingdom. There's this idea of these, I would think, these ambassadors coming with the message of the Savior, and somehow God's kingdom prevails in the end. So, back to who killed Elvis. The guy narrating the movie, his manager, the Tom Hanks character, says the real downfall was the love of applause, that self-absorption, that pride, that being self-centered and everything is about me. I think that's what kills all of us. It kills spiritual life. It kills churches. It kills leadership. It kills cities, and it kills nations. It's what destroyed Edom, that pride. And so as we think about this prophetic word spoken to a particular people who are far from God, I pray that as every one of us read a judgment or warning about pride, that we would respond by humbling ourselves, by crying out to God for deliverance, by getting out of the center and making sure He's in the center, by doing what John the Baptist did when he said, "I must decrease and He must increase." May we all humbly decrease, that Jesus could increase. May we all step out of the center, that He would be the center.